Welcome to Podkey Fantasy Football, where camp battles and ADP swings get a real stress test. This is the point in draft season where one coach quote can move a player 3 rounds and half the market pretends that's new information. The edge isn't reacting fastest, it's figuring out which changes actually matter. The Patriots' backfield is a good example of why highlight plays and fantasy trust are not the same thing. Trevon Henderson brings the explosive juice, but the source note matters here. He can still land in single-digit fantasy weeks, even with decent workload, which usually means the usage isn't stable enough yet. Ramondre Stevenson has the cleaner proof of concept. A 1,000-yard rookie year at 5.1 a carry tells you coaches have already seen a version of this working, even if the fumbles create real friction. If the schedule gets tougher, some staffs lean toward reliability over flash, and that can keep Stevenson more involved than the market wants. In Pittsburgh, the Warren versus Rico Dowdle debate feels overstated because the market gap is already tiny. Warren has the better receiving and maybe goal line upside. Dowdle has the more traditional 3-down frame, and even Vegas leans slightly Dowdle in rushing yards. That's not a profile where you should be acting like there's an obvious breakout winner hiding in plain sight. Jacksonville is more interesting because the roles fit together logically. Baziel Touton got 23 red zone carries and 4 scores as a rookie, plus coach praise for a 3-down path. Chris Rodriguez Jr. gives them sturdy early down and goal line insurance. Quentin Allen Jr. handles receiving depth, and that structure actually helps Touton's RB3 case because the team has contingency options without needing to overstate what he already is. Denver is pure risk pricing. J.K. Dobbins at 5.0 a carry still looks like the best primary runner when healthy, but with his injury history you can't treat that role as durable. R.J. Harvey's 3.7 a carry is less exciting on the ground, yet the receiving floor matters, and Jonah Coleman lurking as a possible 3-down option if Dobbins misses time makes this backfield harder to solve than a simple starter-backup chart. Washington might be the toughest room for drafters because all 3 cases are plausible and none is decisive. Rachaad White gives you the boring but bankable stuff, pass protection and receiving. Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt offers the rushing upside angle. Katron Allen's value lives near the goal line. Without a visible coaching preference, ambiguity itself becomes the story, and that usually compresses value for everyone. Tampa Bay has a different problem. Bucky Irving looked like a bell cow when healthy, but the red zone dip is the warning sign because fantasy ceilings are fragile when the money touches get redistributed. If Kenneth Gainwell really is a 1B and Sean Tucker keeps siphoning goal line work, Irving can still be good without paying off as if he owns the entire scoring profile. Seattle is one of the cleaner early season leverage spots. If Zach Charbonnet's February surgery pushes him past week 1, Darian Price has a real lane to useful volume right away. And if that absence stretches longer, the 3-down path gets more than theoretical. That's why he's attractive in both redraft and dynasty, not because the player suddenly changed, but because availability might hand him a role. The broader draft question behind all of this is whether to hammer running back early. I get the appeal if you think the position falls off fast, but overcommitting early can box you out of wide receiver upside in the exact range where breakout target volume tends to appear. Unless the room is gifting you value, forcing a 2RB start plus a third in round 3 feels more like building around fear than around expected points. With Malik Nabers, the confirmed fact is simple. He did not open camp on active/PUP. That matters because it takes reserve/PUP and the automatic 4-game absence tied to it off the table. What it does not prove is that the knee is fully fine. It tells us the Giants believe he's likely available before week 4, and if he can practice in August and play in September, the healing timeline points toward him being closer to 90 to 95% by the fantasy playoff months. That's a much stronger argument than any blanket he's good or he's hurt take. The draft angle is cost versus timing. Around pick 35, you're paying for a premium player with some early uncertainty, but the payoff window is November and December anyway. The late-season matchups against Detroit and Dallas only matter if the player is on the field, so the real question is whether your roster can absorb imperfect September expectations. Late rounds are where people confuse movement with meaning. Jaden Blue, Terence Ferguson, A.D. Mitchell, Tyquan Thornton, and others getting shoved up from rounds 19 or 20 into the mid-teens tells you the market is awake, not necessarily that the market is right. Thornton being treated as Kansas City's clear WR3 is a real talking point, but clear in July can disappear fast once snap rotations and roster decisions show up. Same with backup battles like Braylon Allen versus Isaiah Davis. Those are exactly the spots where staying flexible beats drafting from an old queue. And some ADP changes are just too small and too narrative-driven to matter. The Montgomery versus Woody Marks shift after split-duty chatter is a good example. If the underlying team context and local reporting didn't actually change much, a fractional ADP move can be the market entertaining itself. Tight end looks more clustered now, true elites, then a middle group like Sam Laporta, then the later value plays. Laporta's camp clearance after microdiscectomy absolutely qualifies as real news, so that DraftKings bump and ADP rise makes sense. The more useful concept is the pocket behind the elites. Mid-range tight ends can gain value disproportionately when target competition gets hurt, and the source specifically points to teammates ahead of them missing time as a lever. That's the kind of contingent upside worth targeting because it has a clear path instead of vague breakout language. The cleanest receiver takeaway is still target volume. Around 7 to 8 targets per game, roughly 136 over a season, is the breakout neighborhood for mid-round wideouts. That's the baseline because volume stabilizes fantasy scoring better than isolated big plays. But efficiency matters more when the offense itself limits total receiver chances. In tighter end-heavy or run-leaning structures, the wideout who does more with each target becomes far more interesting. George Pickens versus CeeDee Lamb was the cited example. Pickens grades much better by yards per catch, yards per target, and fantasy points per target in the sample provided. That does not automatically make Pickens the better fantasy bet overall, because raw volume can swamp per-target efficiency over a full season. What it does show is that if a player's target ceiling is capped by scheme, elite efficiency can keep him viable in a way box score target counts alone might miss. Kansas City has a couple of moving pieces worth separating. If Patrick Mahomes really cuts his rushing attempts roughly in half after feeling like he ran too much last year, that directly lowers his fantasy ceiling. The estimate around 20 to 22 PPR points per game makes sense as a consequence of less dual-threat usage, not as a statement that he's suddenly a worse real-life quarterback. Kenneth Walker, as a possible Brian Westbrook-style receiving piece, is more speculative. The upside case is obvious, but the split in analyst opinion is the important part, because we don't yet know whether his target role grows meaningfully or whether this settles into a more standard rushing deployment. At quarterback overall, Jalen Hurts going as QB6 around pick 57 stands out as the stronger buy low case than most of the camp narratives floating around. When a player has recent top 5 production and the discount is being driven mainly by exaggerated health or availability fears, that's closer to inefficiency than justified caution. A few health notes really do change projections. Charbonnet's surgery matters because it creates early touches elsewhere. Dobbins' history matters because it keeps contingency value alive behind him. George Kittle being on PUP matters less if the expectation is still week 1. The stranger one is Kyle Shanahan being in concussion protocol because it's not a player injury, but it could still affect offensive continuity if game planning gets disrupted. I'd be careful not to overstate that without more detail, but it's fair to flag downstream uncertainty for 49ers pass catchers if the normal preparation rhythm is limited. For upside swings, Luther Burden and Woody Marks fit different molds. Burden has the ceiling case if volume arrives, with the note that touchdowns may be the limiting factor in non-PPR formats. Marks is more role-driven. If the promised third down work in Houston holds, the PPR appeal is straightforward, even if the committee keeps the overall ceiling in check. The useful habit right now is simple. Separate camp facts from camp storytelling, then price the uncertainty honestly. That's the whole game this time of year. Thanks for listening to Podkey Fantasy Football. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.